Long before mushroom clouds seared themselves into history, the story of the atomic bomb began quietly, almost modestly, in the uneasy summer before the world collapsed into total war. On August 2, 1939, Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard drafted a letter he believed might change the fate of nations. Fearing that Adolf Hitler's scientists were racing toward a uranium-based superweapon, Szilard sought the one voice powerful enough to jolt the United States awake. He persuaded Albert Einstein, the world's most recognizable scientific mind, to sign his warning. Einstein's signature carried moral weight, political influence, and international credibility, everything Szilard needed to pierce the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt read the letter and acted with remarkable swiftness. The message triggered the formation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium, a quiet, unpublicized group tasked with determining whether atomic fission could become a military tool. At first, its work was unassuming, almost bureaucratic. Monthly budgets hovered around a mere $6,000, earmarked for early experiments and theoretical groundwork. Yet even these minimal efforts placed the United States on a trajectory toward a scientific frontier no nation had ever crossed. As the world edged closer to catastrophe and Japan prepared to strike at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt deepened America's atomic commitment. The modest committee evolved into something far larger, far bolder. In December 1942, beneath the bleachers of Chicago's Stagg Field Stadium, Enrico Fermi's team successfully created the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. The moment was both miraculous and terrifying, a proof of concept for a weapon of unparalleled power. 6 months earlier, in June 1942, the United States government had taken the next monumental step. It formalized its atomic ambitions under the Army Corps of Engineers as the Manhattan Engineer District, later known simply as the Manhattan Project. But in the White House and War Department corridors, the ultra-secret program circulated under a far simpler, deliberately bland name: S1, Special Project Number 1. S1 was secrecy distilled. It was the quiet code Roosevelt, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, and General Leslie Groves used to speak of the bomb without speaking of it. The name disguised budget lines, masked logistical requests, and hid construction projects from inquisitive congressmen. By the end of the war, the project's cost would swell from thousands per month to a staggering $2 billion, almost all of it hidden inside the federal budget under cleverly titled appropriations. General Leslie Groves, the stern, uncompromising engineer assigned to lead the operation, oversaw a scientific empire unlike anything in American history. The project stretched across the continent. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, handled electromagnetic separation of uranium isotopes. Hanford, Washington, housed massive reactors churning out plutonium. Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the intellectual magnetism of J. Robert Oppenheimer, became the nerve center for designing, assembling, and testing atomic weapons. Each site operated like a sealed world unto itself. Workers were shown only the narrow tasks required for their slice of the mission. Over 130,000 Americans labored across these secret cities, many believing they were producing synthetic rubber or experimenting with new radar technology. Most had no idea they were contributing to a device capable of leveling entire cities. The secrecy wasn't just American paranoia. By 1943, Soviet espionage rings had infiltrated the project. The most damaging mole was Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant German-born physicist working at Los Alamos. Fuchs wasn't just sending summaries, he transmitted highly technical implosion calculations, plutonium data, and design notes to Moscow via couriers. These leaks, later uncovered through the Venona project's decrypted Soviet cables, allowed Joseph Stalin to enter the nuclear arms race years earlier than he otherwise would have. Yet at the time, even President Harry Truman, Roosevelt's own vice president, had no idea the espionage existed. In fact, he knew almost nothing about the bomb at all. The secrecy extended in every direction, even upward. Roosevelt's health was deteriorating rapidly by late 1944. Polio, stress, and decades of chain smoking had ravaged him physically, leaving him increasingly guarded. What remained of his formidable political instinct fused with a deep fear of leaks. Roosevelt trusted almost no one with S1. He told Churchill more than he told Truman. He shared more with Stimson and Groves than with his own inner circle. For Truman, this exclusion was not a deliberate snub. It was simply Roosevelt's way. But it created a surreal irony. While serving as a senator in 1943, Truman had chaired a committee investigating waste in the national defense budget. In that role, he had actually probed suspicious expenses and queer goings-on at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, the very birthplace of Fermi's nuclear breakthrough. Groves stonewalled him thoroughly, feeding him just enough information to deflect attention. Truman dropped the matter, never realizing he had been poking at the heart of the most important military secret in the world. By the time he became vice president on January 20th, 1945, Truman had only 8 meetings with Roosevelt. None involved S1. None hinted at atomic weapons. Their conversations drifted to politics, war strategy, and social chatter, often over cocktails in the White House. Roosevelt kept his greatest wartime undertaking locked behind mental vault doors Truman didn't even know existed. Thus, as World War II entered its final and most bitter months, the United States stood on the brink of ushering humanity into the nuclear age. But its future president remained completely blind to the dawn about to break. Roosevelt's tight circle knew the bomb was nearing completion. They knew the stakes. They knew the weapon could end the war or unleash an era of unimaginable destruction. But Truman, the man destined to wield that power, was still just an observer, unaware that he would soon inherit the most devastating responsibility ever placed on a single human being. Everything was in motion. The secret sites, the scientists, the spies, the chain reactions, the code names, and the president's deepening isolation. S1 was no longer merely a military undertaking. It had become an irreversible scientific and moral plunge into a new world. And Truman had absolutely no idea that world was coming. On April 12, 1945, the world shifted in an instant. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed in Warm Springs, Georgia, felled by a massive cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 63. The news reached Harry S. Truman in the White House, where First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt delivered it with solemn urgency. Truman, who had been vice president for a mere 82 days, faced the daunting reality of sudden leadership. Addressing reporters that evening with a plain-spoken candor rooted in his Missouri upbringing, he said, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Even this cosmic burden, he would soon learn, was only the beginning." 3 days later, on April 25th, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson summoned Truman to the Lincoln bedroom, his temporary presidential suite amid the White House renovations. General Leslie Groves accompanied him, though mostly in silence. There, Stimson laid bare the secret that had been withheld from Truman during his brief vice presidency, S1, the Manhattan Project, the most ambitious and potentially catastrophic scientific endeavor ever undertaken. The scale and implications stunned Truman. Stimson explained that the United States had developed a weapon capable of leveling entire cities in an instant. 3 bomb designs were in motion: a uranium gun-type device, later known as Little Boy, a plutonium implosion bomb, later called Fat Man, and a faltering plutonium gun variant still under study. Stimson and Groves outlined the ethical considerations, the geopolitical ramifications, and the immense responsibility of using or withholding such a device. Truman sat, chain-smoking Camel cigarettes, absorbing the torrent of information. No dramatic outburst came. He nodded once, quietly saying, "Keep me posted." Later, in the privacy of his study, under the dim glow of his desk lamp, Truman recorded the revelation in his leather-bound diary, a habit from his artillery days in World War I. He wrote, "Within the first 4 hours of becoming president, I was told the whole story. I was informed that the United States, through the Army, was perfecting an explosive great enough to destroy the whole world." The weight of those words was more than mere astonishment. Truman likened the disclosure to being let in on a terrible secret, a phrase that captured both awe and dread. He reflected on the queer goings-on at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory that he had probed in 1943, unaware that Fermi's experiments there had already achieved a controlled chain reaction. He remembered the 8 meetings with Roosevelt since January 20th, none of which touched on the atomic project. He had been a senator investigating defense spending, a vice president meeting casually with the president, and suddenly he was the steward of a power that could end civilization as he knew it. The weeks following the revelation were a whirlwind of consultation and deliberation. On May 14th and 15th, Stimson organized meetings with leading scientists, including Vannevar Bush and James Conant, to discuss the bomb's use. Truman weighed options with the seriousness of a man conscious that every choice might mean life or death for hundreds of thousands. Should the bomb be demonstrated on an uninhabited island, shared with allies or international bodies after the war, or used outright against Japan to avoid a conventional invasion which could cost perhaps 1 million American lives? Truman considered each scenario with a mix of pragmatism and moral reflection. By June 1st, Truman convened the Interim Committee, a select assembly of military, scientific, and ethical advisors. The committee debated in private Washington salons, examining target options and discussing operational feasibility, strategic impact, and humanitarian consequences. Truman digested intelligence reports, military projections, and scientific assessments, steadily arriving at a considered path forward. Their recommendation was clear. The bomb should be used to bring Japan to swift surrender, minimizing broader casualties and potentially averting Operation Downfall, the projected Allied invasion of the home islands. The fulcrum of decision crystallized on July 16th with the Trinity test in New Mexico's Jornada del Muerto. The detonation unleashed a 5,000-degree fireball, vaporizing the desert and birthing the mushroom cloud that would define the atomic age. Truman's diary entry, dated July 25th, captured the awe, terror, and pragmatism of the moment. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the most useful." He saw in it both the fire of destruction or the fire of peace, a duality he would carry into his decision-making. Later that day, in a conversation with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, Truman hinted at the weapon's existence, describing it as a new weapon of unusually destructive force. Stalin, already partially informed through espionage, concealed any reaction, maintaining the poker face that would define his dealings with the West. In his 1955 memoir, Year of Decisions, Truman reflected on the enormity of the disclosure. "I had been told by Secretary Stimson that we had inside knowledge of the Japanese peace moves. Now, I was told something far more startling. The United States had a new bomb of extraordinary destructive power, probably decisive in the war, which was ready for use." He labeled Roosevelt's omission unprecedented, leaving him unprepared for the awful responsibility of wielding unprecedented destructive force. Yet Truman never wavered in his conviction regarding its use. "I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never doubted it should be used." This belief guided the fateful actions that followed. On August 6th, Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima, claiming roughly 80,000 lives immediately, with many more succumbing to radiation in the following months. 3 days later, Fat Man destroyed Nagasaki, adding 40,000 more casualties. The total toll, approximately 200,000, was horrific, yet the bomb precipitated Japan's surrender on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri. Truman saw these actions as grim necessities, harsh measures intended to prevent even greater loss of life from a conventional invasion. Throughout his presidency and in later reflections, Truman wrestled with the moral weight of the atomic age. He cautioned against uncontrolled proliferation, describing the bomb as too dangerous to be loose in a lawless world. The Manhattan Project, once a clandestine program known only to Roosevelt's inner circle, had become the fulcrum of global power and a tool that would define Truman's legacy. His diary entries, personal reflections, and public statements collectively reveal a man confronting a responsibility unlike any in human history, a responsibility thrust upon him almost without warning, and a secret that had, for weeks, been entirely his own. The revelation of S-1 was not merely the unveiling of a weapon, it was the awakening of Truman to a new world order, one in which he alone bore the knowledge of humanity's potential annihilation. From private diaries to public memoirs, his words captured the tension between awe, horror, and decisive action. And as he moved forward, the terrible secret Roosevelt had withheld became Truman's defining challenge: to wield, responsibly, the power to end a war and reshape the course of history. By midsummer of 1945, the United States had crossed the threshold from theory to apocalyptic reality. The Manhattan Project, codenamed S-1, was no longer a shadowy program. It had produced a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities in an instant. Harry S. Truman, still absorbing the weight of what he had inherited from Roosevelt, now faced the culmination of years of secret labor, scientific ingenuity, and moral ambiguity. The decisions before him were unprecedented, irreversible, and devastatingly consequential. On May 14th and 15th, Truman convened with Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, alongside scientific luminaries like Vannevar Bush and James Conant. The conversations were sober and deliberate, exploring every conceivable scenario. Should the atomic bomb be demonstrated on an uninhabited island to shock Japan into surrender without loss of life? Should it be shared with allies, perhaps as leverage in the emerging post-war order? Or should it be used directly on Japanese cities to bring the war to a swift conclusion, averting a bloody invasion of the home islands that could claim perhaps 1 million American lives? Truman listened, questioned, and weighed each option with the gravity of a man carrying the fate of millions on his shoulders. By June 1st, he convened the Interim Committee, a select panel of military leaders, civilian officials, and ethical advisors tasked with charting a path forward. Their deliberations in Washington's private chambers combined strategic calculation with moral inquiry. The consensus emerged: the bomb should be used targeted at Japan's military and industrial centers to force surrender and spare the world an even greater catastrophe. Truman absorbed the committee's guidance, understanding that history would judge him not only on victory, but on the choices that had made it possible. The moment of truth arrived on July 16th, with the Trinity test in New Mexico's Jornada del Muerto desert. The detonation of the plutonium implosion device produced a 5,000-degree fireball and the first iconic mushroom cloud, vaporizing the desert floor in a flash of blinding light and heat. Truman's diary entry, recorded on July 25th amid the flurry of the Potsdam Conference, captured the mixture of awe, dread, and pragmatic resolve. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It seems to be the most terrible thing ever discovered, but it can be made the most useful." The president saw in this power both the fire of destruction or the fire of peace, acknowledging the dual-edged nature of atomic force and the heavy mantle it placed on him as commander-in-chief. Even in private diplomacy, Truman could not entirely hide the bomb's presence. During meetings with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, he hinted at the United States' new weapon, describing it as a new weapon of unusually destructive force. Stalin, who had already received partial intelligence from spies like Klaus Fuchs, concealed his knowledge behind the familiar mask of Soviet inscrutability, weighing the implications for the emerging post-war balance of power. Truman's reflections decades later, in his 1955 year of decisions and 1956 years of trial and hope, reveal the gravity with which he carried the knowledge withheld by Roosevelt. He wrote, "I had been told by Secretary Stimson that we had inside knowledge of the Japanese peace moves. Now I was told something far more startling. The United States had a new bomb of extraordinary destructive power, probably decisive in the war, which was ready for use." He acknowledged that the secrecy of the project was unprecedented, leaving him initially unprepared for the awful responsibility that accompanied command of such destructive capability. Yet he never wavered in his judgment regarding its use. "I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never doubted it should be used." The decision materialized in early August. On August 6th, Little Boy, the uranium gun-type bomb, devastated Hiroshima, claiming approximately 80,000 lives instantly, with many more succumbing later to radiation and injuries. 3 days later, Fat Man, the plutonium implosion device, struck Nagasaki, adding 40,000 more deaths to the toll. The total, roughly 200,000 casualties, was staggering. Yet, from Truman's perspective, these were grim necessities. The bomb had brought Japan to surrender, officially ending the war on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, sparing countless lives that would have been lost in a conventional invasion. Even after the war, Truman remained haunted by the power he had wielded and the precedent it set. He cautioned against proliferation, warning that atomic energy was too dangerous to be loose in a lawless world. The bomb, born from secrecy, espionage, and the genius of scientists across the continent, had transformed him from a Missouri haberdasher and senator into the steward of humanity's most formidable force. His diary entries, private reflections, and public memoirs collectively chart a journey of awe, dread, responsibility, and unflinching pragmatism. S1, the Manhattan Project, had revealed itself fully to Truman only after Roosevelt's death. It was a terrible secret, withheld from the man who would have to command its consequences. From the Lincoln bedroom briefing to the Trinity test, from Potsdam diplomacy to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Truman navigated the moral and strategic crucible of unprecedented power. His words, etched in diaries and memoirs, capture the paradox of awe and duty. A man thrust into the epicenter of human destruction, conscious of history's gaze, and determined to wield the terrible secret responsibly, for better or worse. The atomic age had arrived, and with it Truman's legacy. As the reluctant architect of a new world, the bridge from wartime devastation to Cold War tension, and the man who bore the weight of a secret powerful enough to reshape civilization itself.